The Bulldogs took a risk and didn't hit the transfer portal hard this offseason. We're going to go ahead and analyze their transfer portal class as well as a few parts of their recruiting class and kind of give you an overall synopsis of how we think they're going to do in 2026 with a way too early predicted record at the end of the video. Now, to start it off, we'll go ahead and recap 2025. We had them projected to go 9.5 and 2.5. We predicted them to go 9 and 3, ended up being a little bit under that. Some of the teams we thought we had a chance against them just really didn't end up performing as well. Georgia actually went 12 and 2 going to the college football playoff quarterfinals before a close loss to Ole Miss.
Now, looking at the offseason report as of right now, offensively, they returned five starters, and then on defense, they returned six starters, which is pretty solid for this team. However, a lot of those starters are younger guys that have to step up and have increased roles now, or it is like your starting quarterback in Gunnar Stockton, maybe an offensive lineman as well. And the biggest one being Nate Frazier, their starting running back, who originally was going to enter the transfer portal, I believe, but then ended up re-signing with the Bulldogs. Recruiting wise, they have the number 6 high school recruiting class. But like Jonah said at the very beginning, they did not really go to the transfer portal to get players to fill some of those big needs that they have. Only the 31st rank in the transfer portal recruiting, overall coming out to number 10. But just because that the transfer portal ranking isn't as high as some of the other top teams in the country doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be a problem. Yes, college football has sort of moved to transfer portal is where you build your team. We saw successes with teams like Texas Tech being the primary example, but also teams like Houston and Indiana is also very big examples. But you have to keep in mind too, Kirby Smart has been doing this for a while at a very high level, has won national championships building his roster through his own means, and I trust that he's going to do just fine. But even though the transfer portal class isn't as good as some of those other teams, especially in the SEC, they still have a couple big additions that they're adding to this roster. I think the biggest one is Isaiah Canyon at wide receiver because that's going to be the weakest position in a way, just because they lost so many of their senior weapons in that wide receiver room. And a lot of the guys that will be in that wide receiver room now are young guys that will need to step up that haven't had a ton of experience. But Isaiah Canyon brings a lot more experience to the table after a pretty solid season at Georgia Tech. The biggest uh, sort of thing that they needed to address on defense was that secondary, losing their star cornerback in Dalen Everett. But they bring in a couple good secondary players. Jamari Riddle is going to be an excellent safety for them. Gentry Williams out of Oklahoma will also be a guy that has had some experience, but he has been a little inconsistent at times. But I still think he's going to do fairly well as also bringing in Khalil Barnes from Clemson as well, another safety that I think is going to do very well. But the big addition on the defensive line is Amaris Williams. I think he's going to be the best overall player that they got out of the transfer portal. So looking at the grades, talent-wise, A minus, a lot of great players will want to go to Georgia because that brand has been so strong. But needs-wise, like we said, not hitting the transfer portal so hard is going to tank that grade a little bit. So we're only giving it a B, so overall coming out to a B plus.
Moving on to their schedule, the Bulldogs have 7 home games this season, 4 away, and the neutral site game against Florida, this time in Atlanta, not Jacksonville this season. Starting off the year, Tennessee State, Western Kentucky, both of those are essentially free wins. And you go on the road to Arkansas. No more Taylon Green for the Razorbacks. You're going to be a new guy at quarterback this season, and really Arkansas struggled a lot last year. I really think this is a game that Georgia should be able to dominate, even though they're going to be on the road. Just a lot more returning production for the Bulldogs, and overall, they're just a significantly better team.
First real test of the season is going to be hosting Oklahoma as they bring back John Mateer, who hopefully for this entire season can remain healthy because when he was at 100%, he was one of the best quarterbacks in college football, had an early Heisman case that was ultimately tanked by that injury. But overall, Oklahoma, the biggest thing they need to do is rebuild that defense because so many of those key players have left, whether that's running out of eligibility, going to the NFL draft, or entering the transfer portal. But they have done a great job over the past couple seasons of having a very solid defense. So I do think this can be a little bit of trouble for the Bulldogs, especially with so many young players stepping up into those key roles. But I do think at the end of the day, Georgia will be favored at home because Athens is one of the hardest stadiums to play in the country. Vandy after that, I think Vandy is going to take a major step back just with how much production they're losing from this past season. It's going to hurt for those Commodore fans that think that now they are a football school, but I think they will see a regression to the norm this season. Georgia should be heavy favorites at home here. And then, of course, they have a road game against Alabama. This game, regardless of how good or bad the teams are, always ends up being a super explosive, interesting, and close game that could go either way. The fact that it's at Bryant-Denny Stadium, I do think gives Alabama some edge in that game, despite the fact that I think Georgia's roster as of right now is much stronger than Alabama because you had that continuity at quarterback with Gunnar Stockton. Meanwhile, the Crimson Tide will have a quarterback battle between two guys that, yes, they have been at the program, but have not had any meaningful reps in a couple of years. So I do think this is once again going to be a close game like it is every year, and Bama might be able to pull off that upset because they're at home. But I do think as of right now, Georgia has the better roster, so we are going to give them the slight edge in this one.
The next three games are actually really interesting because all three teams have new head coaches this season. The first one is Alex Golesh at Auburn. Now, the Tigers, a lot of people thought were going to be successful last season. We kind of put a bit of a damper on that. We didn't necessarily fall for that hype train. And I think this season, the same thing is kind of happening. I'm a little bit more inclined to start to believe it, though, because I really like Byron Brown at the cornerback position. And I do think that Golish is going to do a solid job at Auburn. They just have a really tough schedule. The fact that they're going on the road to Georgia here, I really do think Georgia should be able to win this game. And honestly, I think the biggest thing here for Georgia is the fact that they have a bye week afterwards because they don't have the ability really to look ahead to their rivalry game against Florida. If this Auburn game was, say, the week before the road trip to Bama, I would be a lot more confident that Auburn had a chance to win it. Now, after the bye week, they're going to face Florida in Atlanta, the neutral site game there. And Florida is bringing in John Summerall from Tulane as their new head coach. And I do think he's going to do a solid job, but he's going to need time. The schedule that Florida has this season is just horrible. And I really think that by this point in the year, the whole program is going to just be beaten down. I really think the Gators are going to struggle a lot this season. And I don't see them having much of a chance in this game against Georgia, aside from the fact that it is a rivalry game. You never really know what can happen there, but I feel pretty confident in saying that Georgia is very likely to win this game. And then we have Ole Miss. Now, Ole Miss was quite the story this offseason after Pete Golding took them to the college football playoff semifinals following the departure of Lane Kiffin. The biggest question for Ole Miss is whether or not Trinidad Chambliss is going to be able to get his eligibility for one more season. If not, the Rebels will be left to Deuce Knight as their starting quarterback, who has a lot of hype around him, but really hasn't had many meaningful reps. By this point in the season, obviously we will know whether or not Deuce Knight is good enough, assuming that he is the starting quarterback. And I do think Pete Golding is going to do a very solid job as the head coach. Obviously, like I said, we saw him lead this team to the semifinals, but I do wonder if a little part of that run was due to the fact that the team kind of wanted to prove Lane Kiffin wrong. Maybe there's a little bit too much hype on Ole Miss going into next season. In our way too early top 25, which you can go check out on our channel, we were a little bit lower on the Rebels than most, but did still have them ranked. I don't think this will be an easy game for Georgia necessarily, but I do still think they will be favored despite being on the road.
The last two games of the season are a little bit interesting, but I do think for the most part, Georgia will be the favorite in all three of them. The first game up is Missouri at home, and Missouri is bringing in Austin Simmons, the former Ole Miss quarterback, to be their starting quarterback after he did end up getting benched for Trinidad Chambliss. And I do think the combination of him with Ahmad Hardy, who was the best running back in the SEC last season and one of the best running backs in the entire country last season, that dynamic duo is going to be tough for many opposing defenses to stop, but I do think Georgia will be well equipped for it, especially bringing in Amaris Williams on that defensive line. But could still be an interesting game because Austin Simmons has been in the SEC for 2 years, so he's somewhat familiar with what Georgia brings to the table, especially considering that he was on the sidelines of the game last season. And after that, on the road for the final time against South Carolina, a team that we were very high on last season, and that all came crashing down. Lenora Sellers was plagued with some injuries. The defense, after losing a couple of key players that were integral to their success 2 years ago, did not really return to form, and they suffered tremendously. But they do have Lenora Sellers back again. Just because of that fact, and with it being on the road, I do think South Carolina could surprise some people and still be a competitive team, but I do think that they're not going to be in contention for an SEC title or a college football playoff spot. This is more about them getting to a bowl game, and I do think this could be a major upset if Georgia is looking ahead a little bit to another rivalry game. But they have been in control of that rivalry game, so I do think they will handle business here. And then that final game is against Georgia Tech. The last 2 years, it has been pretty entertaining football. You had that 7 or 8 overtime game 2 years ago, and then a super low scoring affair last season. We were pretty confident that Georgia Tech could pull off that upset last season, and the offense just was not there to really take advantage of Georgia's defense that at times had struggled, but that was when they started to build up momentum. But this year, I do think Georgia is going to be the far superior team because Georgia Tech no longer has a offense that we are very high on or trust very much. Bringing in Alberto Mendoza as a starting quarterback, he can be serviceable, but he's not going to end up turning into Fernando Mendoza and being a Heisman winner this season for Georgia Tech. I do think at the end of the day, at home, the Bulldogs are going to continue to dominate this rivalry.
The 2026 projections overall, we have the Bulldogs going at 9-3. This is just from adding up all of those percentages. 6.25 wins in the SEC. And our way too early prediction for Georgia is 11-1, 8-1 in SEC play. So we do think that out of all of the games on their schedule, it's most likely to be an SEC game that they do drop. Right now, kind of leaning towards Alabama as that game, but there's a few different candidates it could be. Nothing's really set in stone as far as which game we're predicting there. Mainly, it's just that we think at this time the Bulldogs will go 11-1. And then their national championship odds from Vegas, we have plus 1100 right now, which is good for sixth in the country. So, thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe as we have expectations for every single Power 4 team coming out over the course of the offseason every single day. So, with that being said, we'll see you in the next video.